In the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful. Hello everyone, thank you so much for being here today. I'm really excited to talk about the innovative ways to teach the 4 language skills in second language acquisition. As you can see on this slide, we'll be focusing on listening, speaking, reading, and writing skills, the 4 essential skills that language learners need to develop. The 2 on the left, listening and reading, are what we call receptive skills, where students take in language. The 2 on the right, speaking and writing, are productive skills, where students create language. This presentation is based on research from some big names in the field: Gass and Selinger, Michel and Miles, Rod Ellis and Van Patten. I've tried to pull out the most practical and cutting-edge ideas from their work to share with you today. So let's dive in and explore how we can make language teaching more effective and engaging for our students. What is second language acquisition, or SLA? Before we jump into teaching methods, let's make sure we're all on the same page about what second language acquisition really is. SLA is basically the study of how people learn additional languages after they've already learned their first language. It looks at all the processes and factors that influence how we pick up a new language. One of the key concepts you'll hear about in SLA is interlanguage, a term coined by Selinger back in 1972. This is super interesting. It's like the developing language system that exists in a learner's mind. It's not quite their first language, and it's not quite their target language either. It's its own unique system that evolves as the learner progresses. For example, if you've ever heard a Spanish speaker say something like, "I am here since 3 days," instead of "I've been here for 3 days," that's interlanguage in action. It's not wrong, it's just part of the developmental process. SLA research helps us understand how language skills develop, what factors influence language learning, for example, age, motivation, learning environment, and most importantly for us as teachers, how we optimize our teaching methods. On the right side of this slide, you can see the 4 language skills we'll be focusing on today: listening and reading as receptive skills, like I said, and speaking and writing as the productive skills. The ultimate goal is to communicate, is communicative competence, being able to use the language effectively in real-world situations, not just knowing grammar rules. Now let's look at the 3 major theories that form the foundation of language learning. They're absolutely crucial to understand if we want to innovate in teaching the 4 skills. First, we have Krashen's input hypothesis. Krashen says that learning acquire language through what he calls comprehensible input, language that's just a bit beyond their current level. He presents this with the formula I+1, where I is the learner's current level and +1 is just a bit more challenging. For example, if I'm talking to a beginner student, I might speak a bit slower and use simpler words, but not so simple that they don't learn anything new. Think about how you talk to a toddler. You don't use baby talk, but you do simplify your language a bit. And that's the I+1 concept in action. Second, we have Long's interaction hypothesis. Long says that interaction is essential for learning. When learners have to negotiate for meaning, like when they say, "Sorry, I don't understand," or "What do you mean?" that's when they notice gaps in their knowledge. It's these moments of confusion and clarification that actually drive learning forward. Think about how much more you learn when you're actively involved in a conversation versus just listening to a lecture. And third, we have Swain's output hypothesis. Swain argues that just listening and reading isn't enough. Learners need to produce language too. When they speak or write, they notice their own errors. They test their hypothesis about how the language works, and they develop fluency. It's like the difference between knowing how a bike works and actually being able to ride it. You can read about bike riding all day, but until you get on the bike and try it yourself, you won't really learn to ride. If you look at the radar chart on the right, you can see how each approach affects different language skills. Input-focused approaches are strongest for listening and reading. Interaction-focused approach are great for speaking and grammar, and output-focused approach excellent at writing and speaking. What's the most traditional way to teach listening? Usually we play an audio file and then ask some questions, but this approach is pretty passive and doesn't really engage students. So what are some innovative approaches? First, we have authentic materials. Instead of using artificial dialogues from textbooks, we can use podcasts, news broadcasts, and songs that expose learners to real language as it's actually used. For example, instead of a textbook dialogue about ordering coffee, why not use a clip from a TV show where characters are in a coffee shop? This helps prepare students for real-world listening situations where people speak quickly, use slang, and don't follow a script. Second, we have task-based listening. This means giving students a specific goal when they listen, like filling out a form or following directions on a map. For instance, you might have students listen to a weather forecast and then decide what clothes to pack for a trip. This makes listening purposeful rather than passive. Third, we have interactive listening. With technology, we can create interactive exercises that provide immediate feedback and scaffolding. For example, apps that let the students control the speed of audio or get instant translations of difficult words, or activities where students listen and then physically respond, like total physical response activities. And fourth, we have metacognitive strategies. This means teaching students how to monitor and evaluate their own comprehension skills, like predicting content, identifying keywords, and recognizing when understanding breaks down. For example, before listening, you might ask the students to predict what they'll hear based on their title or images. During listening, they might identify keywords. After listening, they could evaluate how well they understand and what strategies help them. Speaking skills. In traditional approaches, speaking activities tend to be quite controlled. Think of those repetition drills or script dialogues where students just fill in the blanks. These activities have their place, especially for beginners, but they don't really prepare students for real-world communication. One of the most important innovative approaches is task-based language teaching, or TBLT, which was developed by Rod Ellis. In TBLT, instead of focusing on language forms, students focus on completing a real-world task. For example, instead of saying, today we're going to practice the past tense, you might say, today we're going to talk about our last vacation. And the students naturally use the past tense while completing this task. It's like learning to use a hammer by building a birdhouse, not by practicing hammering motions in the air. Research shows that TBLT has led to a 35% increase in speaking proficiency compared to traditional methods, and that's a huge improvement. Other innovative techniques include information gap activities, where each student has part of the information and they need to communicate to complete the task. For example, student A has a map and student B has directions, and they need to work together to find the destination. Or student A has information about train schedule A, and student B has information about train schedule B, and they need to figure out what train is better for a given situation. Role plays and simulations are also fantastic. The students practice language. If you look at the chart on the right, you can see that innovative approaches outperform traditional methods in most areas, especially in fluency, confidence, cultural awareness, and strategic competence. Traditional methods are only slightly outperform in accuracy, which makes sense since they often focus heavily on grammatical correctness. By integrating these approaches, we can help our students develop both fluency and accuracy while building their confidence for real-world communication. Remember, the goal isn't perfect grammar, it's effective communication. Now let's get to reading strategies. In traditional approaches, reading instruction often looks like this. Students read the text and then answer some comprehension questions. It's a pretty passive process. but active reading strategies have emerged as game changers for second language reading development. These strategies get students actively engaged with the text, which leads to faster comprehension and deeper understanding. Let's break down the key concepts and components of active reading. First, we have pre-reading activities. These happen before students even start reading the text. Things like discussing the topic, predicting content based on the title or images, or activating prior knowledge. For example, if students are going to read about climate change, you might first have a discussion about what they already know about the topic, or you might have them look at the title, subheadings, and images and predict what the text will be about. This creates a mental framework for the new information they're about to encounter. Second, we have one reading activities. These are strategies students use during reading, like annotating the text, highlighting key information, or asking questions as they read. For example, you might have students highlight all the main ideas in one color and supporting details in another. Or you might have them write questions in the margins when they encounter something they don't understand. These strategies keep students engaged and help them monitor their own comprehension. Third, we have post-reading activities. After reading, students might summarize the text, discuss it with peers, or respond to it in some way. For example, they might create a mind map of the main ideas, debate a controversial points from the text, or write a response from their own perspective. These activities help solidify understanding and encourage critical thinking about the text. And finally, we have extensive reading. This is reading for pleasure, giving students lots of easy, enjoyable text to build fluency and vocabulary naturally. It's like the language learning equivalent of jogging. It builds endurance and makes the more intensive work easier. And if you look at the chart on the right, you can see that active reading approaches outperform traditional approaches across all measures of comprehension. The biggest improvement is the inference making, the ability to understand implied meanings, where we see a 23% improvement. Overall, there's a 37% improvement in comprehension when using active reading strategies. Despite all the advances we've made in language teaching methodologies, writing instruction remains particularly difficult for many teachers. Why? Because it's complex, it's time-consuming, and it requires a lot of individualized feedback. In traditional approaches to writing instruction, the focus is primarily on the product, the final piece of writing. Teachers typically assign a topic, students write an essay, and then teachers correct it. But this approach doesn't really teach students how to write, it just evaluates what they've written. Research from Van Patten and Williams show that process-oriented approaches to writing instruction have shown 3 times greater improvement in student outcomes compared to those traditional product-focused methods. That's a huge difference. So what are these innovative approaches to writing instruction? First, we have the process-oriented approach. Instead of focusing just on the final product, we focus on the entire writing process: planning, drafting, revising, and editing. For example, students might start by brainstorming ideas and then create an outline, write the first draft, get feedback from peers or the teacher, revise based on that feedback, edit for grammar and spelling, and finally produce a final draft. This helps the student understand that good writing doesn't just happen, it's developed through multiple stages. Second, we have collaborative writing. Students work together to produce text, providing peer feedback and support. For example, students might work in pairs to write a story, with each student contributing ideas and helping to refine the writing. Or they might exchange drafts and provide feedback to each other. This not only improves the quality of writing, but also makes the process more engaging and less intimidating. Third, we have technology integration. Tools like blogs, wikis, and Google Docs allow for collaborative writing and instant feedback. For example, students might write blog posts and comment on each other's work, like what we do on PB work. Now that we have looked at innovative approaches for teaching, each of the four skills individually, let's talk about how to integrate them, because in real life we rarely use just one language skill at a time, right? And one of the best frameworks for this integration is project-based learning, or PBL. In PBL, students work on extended projects that involve all four language skills in meaningful context. For example, let's say students are creating a community cultural guide. They would research local cultural sites, which is reading, interview community members, which is listening and speaking, create a multimedia guide, writing and speaking, and present their work to the class, is speaking. All three elements are essential for developing well-rounded language skills. The students need comprehensible input to acquire new language, meaningful interaction to negotiate meaning, and opportunities for output to develop fluency and accuracy. But I want to thank you all for your attention today.